Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast in partnership with Dragos. NERC CIP, Continuous Implementation Project, or Change-Induced Panic. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Tim Conway, Technical Director for ICS and SCADA programs at SANS, and Jason D. Christopher, Certified Instructor for the SANS Industrial Control Systems curriculum. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Carol. As the introduction went, my name is Jason Christopher. I am the Principal Cyber Risk Advisor here at Dragos. I am also a SANS instructor for one of the things we're going to talk about today, which is NERC CIP, leveraging the SANS ICS 456 course, which was co-authored by my co-presenter today, Tim Conway, who is the ICS Curriculum Director. And Tim, thank you again for being able to walk through what's going to be what I hope is a not induced panic stricken webinar.
It'll be very exciting. We'll see where we land.
So for those of you who do not know about Dragos, so we are actually an industrial security firm, meaning that we focus not so much on the traditional IT infrastructure that you may be familiar with, but with that industrial makeup, right? The zeros and ones aren't being stored data like credit card records or things of that nature, but the zeros and ones are actually changing things in the real world. We're talking about processes that may be linked to manufacturing or chemical facilities or mining, or in the case of today's discussion, the electric sector. Now, when we think through the electric sector, we can't go through a conversation about NERC CIP, especially for those of you who are on the webinar who have never heard of NERC CIP before, without showing the lovely, hey, what is the sector chart? So for those of you who aren't familiar with how you get power when you turn on the light switch, just for a very simple high-level overview before we dive into some of those new things that are coming from regulations. If you're sort of a regulations nerd, or you really just like to hear what happens in other sectors, just note that the things that we're going to be discussing today are focusing on only a subsection of the sector. When you think about, I turn on the light switch and I'm down here in distribution where I've got outlets that look very, very normal. I can recognize these outside my house. I maybe drive by this every once in a while. That is going to be the conversation of non-regulated space. It's not going to be the things we're talking about with regards to the critical infrastructure protection standards that are mandatory regulations for every utility in North America. Instead, we're going to be talking about things that are at generation sites or at substations, things that are going to be very large and industrial spaces where there's bigger impacts could be felt across the sector as a result. And if you're unfamiliar with it, this is really what it looks like. So we have 5,000 plants in the United States that are focusing in some way, shape, or form on these standards we'll be talking about. And the transmission lines covering over 160,000 miles across the North American landscape itself. Now you can see here, there's also going to be a larger conversation that we're going to want to have about how we got here, but it's really only impacting, again, just a portion of the sector when we discuss it. And if you're new to CIP, you may hear a lot of conversations, even if you're not new to CIP, what am I saying? If you're not new to CIP, you're probably also hearing the conversations about like, well, there's so much change in the standards and we keep on evolving these things and the threat landscape changes and there's always going to be this lag in regulation and how do we manage all of that? Well, you should know that the journey itself took many, many years. We started off with a standard called Urgent Action 1200, which really focused on control centers. And if you think about sort of the cyber risks at the time, we weren't worried about the same threats that we were worried about today. As a matter of fact, when this standard was approved, which, funny story, was actually the day before the 2003 blackout, it was focusing on untargeted malware that just so happened to find its way into a control center. It wasn't something where there was nation state adversaries that were targeting control centers that we were reacting to. It was somebody walked in with a USB stick they shouldn't have, or plugged in something, or clicked on a link they shouldn't have, and now we're dealing with Slammer or Code Red or something that was an untargeted piece of malware that traditionally found itself in the IT area, working and feeling like, oh, well, that's in the control center. We really shouldn't have that there. What do we do next? And then we expanded that to include field assets, field devices, things that you now sort of, again, go into that diagram of what's on poles or what's behind fences. We expanded the standard into Urgent Action 1200 before finalizing into mandatory standards that we all know and love today, the first versions of them being versions 1 through 3 of NERC CIP, where we then had this big evolutionary push into version 5. And so for those of you who have been following the standards for many years, you're aware of this push, you're aware that there's been a big change that happened with how it is that we categorize things from this ye old versions 1 through 3 to version 5. And to today, where we talk about it sort of being the wild, wild west, version X. There are many standards now that are at different versioning levels, all of whom have got the same DNA of version 5 and the DNA from the previous requirements we had in version 3, and even dated back to urgent action. We can trace back these requirements for many, many years at this point. And if you really want to have a quiz about this, we can go through all the list of standards, but for today, we're going to focus on a subsection of them, because those are the ones that are really going to impact utilities the most going into 2021, that we think are really sort of not, again, inducing panic, but being able to understand the evolution that is taking place with these requirements. If you are new to CIP, you're going to see all these words on this page and be like, wow, that's a lot. And it is. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we do when we talk about ICS 456 and how it is that you train people to become CIP practitioners, it's understanding that CIP actually covers an entire program, right? You may, as a champion, be really good at vulnerability management, in which case you'd find yourself working in the universe of CIP 7 and CIP 10 in particular. However, from a whole programmatic perspective, CIP is really trying to cover all the bases of what you'll need just for any program, but in this case, really honing in on what's down for regulation. With that entire evolution, utilities themselves are going to have a lot of challenges in CIP compliance, and we'll talk through that over the course of this webinar, not just from the perspective of the new changes, but the difficulties we already face. And when you talk to a utility, they're going to have their own unique perspectives about this. The fact that if you have any miss, it would be a miss, and therefore you'd have a possible violation. Talking to a federal regulator, the zero deficiency requirements is a term you'll hear thrown out to describe that I don't get sort of a wiggle room. There's no gray area. It either is or it is not. And it makes it really difficult then to be able to make sure you're capturing the right artifacts so that you're always in compliance, quote unquote, despite the fact that you have these rolling calendars and a whole lot of responsibilities that are just generally difficult, not so much even from the technology piece, but also from how you're tracking it. And there are regional differences in how you're audited, how your peers are audited, and it doesn't really lend itself to this conversation about how to comply, quote unquote. There are utilities out there who look at a requirement and say, I really want to know what you want me to do. Please just tell me. That is a double-edged sword though, because there are going to be other utilities. When you think of the entire makeup of the landscape here, we're talking about thousands of utilities. Not all thousands of utilities are going to agree to that how to comply. So what one person's sort of, this is what I'm going to use for my compliance program, may not be the silver bullet for every utility in the United States. Evidence collection is burdensome, and the people, processes, and technology are always going to be limited. We only have so many experts in this field, and there's only so much we can do with technology that, by its definition, has to be withstanding decades instead of years, right? When we think about the elements that are on the grid, we're not talking about things like my iPhone that I'm going to get a new version of every couple of years. We're talking about something that's going to be out there for a prolonged period of time. So those requirements really have to absorb what that sort of legacy equipment piece could look like. And of course, you'll always hear that compliance is not equal security. And again, these are sort of common complaints. What Tim and I will always challenge people on is you can always have a culture of compliance and a culture of security that support one another. And that's some of the things that I hope we'll get to by the end of the day. But utilities aren't the only people who are concerned with what's happening in NERC CIP. And so regulators also have their own perspective. And the number one question, and we just saw this summer, and we'll talk about it again, regulators asking, is enough covered? Are these standards enough? Is it really what we're trying to do here in a way that makes it so that we can be certain if there were to be some sort of cybersecurity incident that we're able to cover our bases for the most part? The lack of evidence to that burdensome piece that utilities are talking about, from a regulator's perspective, well, the lack of evidence could mean a lack of security. If you cannot prove it to me, how do I know that it actually exists? And this idea that compliance needs to be baked into security, that they don't have to be adversarial, is one of the things you'll constantly hear from regulators when they're thinking about the improvements to NERC CIP processes. However, they also face the same process, people, and technology limitations. They're aware of them, but they themselves have to deal with it too. That limitation in how many people are trained for this type of thing is really front and center for a lot of regulators as well as utilities. So when you look at those like different perspectives, the truth itself is nuanced, right? There's not going to be simply one way to discuss this. The truth is that violations are increasing. CIP since version 5, there have been an uptick in possible violations across industry. Industry is also improving. We see a lot of lessons learned being applied. There are industry exercises that are mature and national level events now. And we're also seeing sort of mixed cultural impacts with, again, thousands of utilities that need to apply something in NERC CIP. Not everyone is going to do it the same way. Not everyone is going to have that nuanced conversation between compliance and security. And so understanding that, it really comes down to how are we moving forward and how are we evolving? But a lot of that comes down to culture, followed with one of the favorite quotes of Tim and myself when we talk about what are possible violations. A lot of them historically have been public, though there's now a thing where we're not going to see new ones being published. This quote actually came from a possible violation in the reliability first region, that the root causes of these CIP violations were cultural issues that resulted in the URE, the utility, management's lack of awareness, engagement, and accountability for CIP compliance. Linking again where the culture pieces fit as we get there, and knowing that those violations aren't necessarily always technology-based as much as they could be parts of things that are happening in your team or things that are happening with education or training. So what now? Now that we sort of like laid down the problem statement of evolving standards that have unique perspectives from utilities, unique perspectives from regulators, what are the things that are changing that have got Tim and I so riled up that we said we need to do a webinar about this and start talking about it in a more open context? Well, here are the 5 topics we want to talk to you about today. We're going to start off with the changes that are coming from incident response. We're also going to link that to the new things that are coming for control center communications. We'll dovetail a little bit into sort of a tandem thing that happens with supply chain and the recent executive orders, so the other things that are happening in the federal government that are outside of CIP, and then land on virtualization, which has got some of the other concerning pieces that we want to highlight for utilities as they get ready into their 2021 plans. You're going to ask yourself, as you see some of these slides, where did this content come from? There's a lot of content that we're going to jam into sort of this 1 hour that we have with you. And this actually comes from the course that Tim and I teach, ICS 456 for NERC CIP Essentials. So over 3 years, we've had hundreds of students go through this course where we demonstrate not just a foundational sort of knowledge for the CIP standards themselves, but also help people get into the GCIP certification, which if you haven't checked out the GIAC GCIP, I highly recommend it. It sort of gives you that level playing field about understanding that somebody, when they say, hey, I am a CIP guru, or I am a CIP ninja warrior with real Kung Fu grip, those are like sort of these catchy phrases we use to talk about ourselves as CIP professionals. But now I can see us having a more mature conversation about saying, well, I'm a GCIP certified professional. And we do that through, again, not just chasing down the requirements, but within the course, we actually have 20 hands-on labs that give you sort of that technical background behind what the requirements are trying to do. And it's now on demand. So if you like this sort of smooth baritone voice that you're hearing now, you can enjoy that for 5 days in a virtual format for the on-demand course that we have. And that's where some of the content is coming from. So as I switch over to Tim to talk about things for incident response, you're going to get some sneak peek at the content that we have with boots on the ground takeaway from utilities, from auditors, from our own experience as asset owners and regulators that we've baked into this course over the past couple of years. It's usually updated when the standards are mandatory and enforceable. However, 2020 really forced us to have a conversation about things before they became enforceable. And so some of the things that you're going to see are things that aren't there yet, right? They're not things that you have to worry about for some of the standards. For others, you absolutely need to, and we'll talk about that. But for the things that are coming down the pike, as it were, you're going to see some sort of preamble material, some new stuff. And so from that, you'll just launch directly into the course. And with that, Tim, I got a smooth transition into actual course material. Why don't we start off with you talking about incident response?
That's great. So as Jason indicated, we're going to go through incident response CIP 008, then control center comms CIP 12, and supply chain CIP 13. And then we will talk a little bit about some extended supply chain outside of CIP with the executive order. And depending on time, we'll talk about the ongoing virtualization efforts. Each one of these topics could really be a hour webcast in and of itself, followed by a 2-hour module where we're doing some labs to reinforce that material the way we do in class. and we could kind of broke this up into 5 different webcasts, but in general, the people who are living, eating, breathing kind of SIP every day, they have an area of focus or potentially programmatic across the entire SIP program at their utility. For those that are really, really focused on SIP 8, they are probably very informed and have been tracking kind of implementation and effective dates and the differences. Same thing for SIP 12, same thing for SIP 13, same thing for the virtualization. So what we're going to try to do is go quickly, inch deep, mile wide, kind of across all of these topics, because we've sort of found that the people who are in it every single day, again, a 2-hour webcast on a topic would be good, but there's a tremendous amount of people that are just trying to stay above water with SIP programs, and kind of managing and maintaining a SIP compliance program day to day is hard, but then also knowing all the things that are coming and how it's going to change their programs and what they need to be looking out for in the future is really, really hard. So we're going to do as quick as we can, just some discussions of changes that are coming, try to focus on 2 things you need to know and 1 thing you should watch out for each one of these topics that we zip through. So starting with SIP 8, we'll talk about it as today. These definitions are the same, but the cybersecurity incident, kind of this malicious act or suspicious event, and this is towards kind of other terms like your electronic security perimeter, your physical security perimeter, and a kind of a compromise or a disruption of a BES cyber system. Anything that kind of fits that bill would be a cybersecurity incident. And again, in a lot of ways with NERC CIP, with the really, really difficult work and what the standards drafting teams are working on every day, and those dedicated volunteers that are moving this forward, this is like a 12-step program where kind of going historically back in time, first acknowledging there's a problem and that we needed the 1200s and the 1300s in version 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we continue to march up. Before, we never really had a definition of what a cybersecurity incident was. Now, kind of in this version where we have it and we have a defined term, this is a step up in improving, kind of getting everybody to one place on what is a cybersecurity incident. Then moving past that to and hey, if one of those things happens where there's a compromise or there's a disruption of a system, and that compromise or that disruption leads to a reliability event, leads to some task that an organization is obligated to perform based on their functional registration, then that would trigger a reportable cybersecurity incident. I'm going to try to do some advancing here, Jason. Yep. So again, just visually, if there's a compromise of the physical security perimeter or the electronic security perimeter, or if there is a disruption of an actual cyber system. So if you pause there for a second and think about it, and you say, well, wait a minute. So if somebody compromised our ESP or our PSP, and they are inside of a facility electronically, logically, or physically, and then they further go on to cause a disruption of the cyber assets that are there, that's certainly a cybersecurity incident, but that's not reportable, and that would be a large question mark. And again, keep in mind that we've been progressing over time. We came from, there was no incident response plans required for critical infrastructure. Then we came to yes, you need a SIP 8 incident response plan, but you got to decide what an incident was and whether you were going to report it or not. Then you move into what we're looking at now, where there's defined terms, so we're constantly moving and improving. But this question mark of if an adversary compromised and disrupted, that's not reportable unless that compromise or disruption caused a reliability event. So if adversary nation was in your environment for months, if they were the ones supporting it, if they were the ones kind of patching it and keeping it up to date, as long as they didn't cause any reliability events, then it wouldn't be reportable. So that's been the question mark of, is that the way we should be operating? And is that giving us the necessary visibility to events that are happening across North America or in various utility infrastructure? So moving towards kind of the SIP 8 version 6 that is coming Jan 1, 2021. So we get to sort of pretend like we have this way of old, but it's only here for another few weeks. And then we move into kind of the 2 things you need to know is you're going to be tracking and kind of investigating more and more things, and you're going to be reporting those types of events and those types of things to more people than previous. So in kind of requirement 1 language, you're going to be looking towards looking at compromises or attempts to compromise for the ESP or the EACMSs. And as you go and identify those things, so you have to hunt them down, you have to understand what an attempt to compromise is for you. As the word attempt is not defined in the NERC glossary of terms, you need to kind of work through your programs, work through your definitions, work through your approaches, come to a point where if you identify there's an attempt or disruption or any of the above that hits that trigger point, now you have reporting to perform. And it's not the reporting of the version CIP 008 version 5 that we're living with now, where you have to notify the EISAC. This is notifying the EISAC, but you have to include certain minimum reporting detail. You have to do an initial report, follow-on reports. There's an entire structure that looks a little bit more like what some are familiar with kind of the OE 417 reports, where it isn't just an initial filing, but there's follow-on and update reports and a whole series of things. So from an EISAC perspective, this is going to be more data coming in than they're used to, meaning this not only is this impacting the utilities, but it's also impacting the receiving end of these reports from the EISAC side and their staffing and their watch floor and how they're going to handle and process these and sort of track to determine if there's something that's happening that's potentially coordinated, how they're going to handle beyond just an initial report to follow on and closeouts, how they're going to handle kind of the detail that's in those reports and the sensitivity of it. In addition, there's another organization that you're going to be reporting to, which is DHS and the NKEK. So specifically kind of in these reports, you'll have an initial notification, kind of the functional impact, which again, if you think about that for a second, the amount of work and effort to go determine what was the attack vector, what was the level of instruction attempted or achieved, what was the impact that occurred, if there was one, getting the initial notification out if it's reportable within an hour, and then doing follow-up kind of updates and continue to do those updates of lessons learned or any new information. Understanding all of that, the one key word that we highlight here is this word attempts, that understanding you will need to determine what does that look like? What do you define as an attempt? This is one of those things where kind of the standards grow and mature over time. If you look back kind of to the CIP 001, one of the first CIP standards that we had, and there was a very similar word there where you had to report attempts of sabotage, and kind of every utility handled that differently. I can recall audits where we kind of sat and spent sort of anchored on that word 2.5, 3, 4 hours with dictionaries and all kinds of things of what does the word sabotage mean to you? And does it imply some level of intent? And if you, level of investigation you would have to perform to determine that. And similar conversations are happening now along the word attempt for CIP 8. So certainly that is an area for you to pay attention to be aware of. A couple of things to track here is now you are looking at attempts and you're reporting to new people as indicated with DHS and NKEK. For those not familiar with NKEK, I've been told, just a big asterisk here, that there may be a name change coming in the very near future, but history from NKEK, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, that has kind of a legacy of a number of feed-in organizations. If you sort of navigate their webpage, you can see kind of the DNA tree, the ancestry.com of where NKEK has come from. And even looking ahead, kind of learning, the standards drafting team has learned from acts of the past where we used to have report to the ESISAC, and then that changed to the EISAC, and they had to go modify that in the standards.
It sounds like a regulatory loophole right there, Tim.
Yeah, yeah. The NKEK modification, even in the standard now, it's or kind of the follow-on organization or associated organization in case it should get a name change, which is, from what I understand, in the possible future. Also looking towards efforts along the word attempt. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if, yeah, there we go. So as industry, just we've learned a lot from kind of lessons learned and the active kind of working groups that have been going through kind of the version 5 transition group, the standards drafting team from the 2016 projects. But a significant amount of effort has gone into developing an implementation guide to sort of say, what would an attempt be as you see an incident or some event occur and you start working down this path of an attempt that didn't have a reliability impact or a functional impact versus a reportable down this chain, and certainly something could go from here and then move over. But a ton of work in regards to what would be an attempt or a compromise and of what type of system and whether it was logical or physical. Tons and tons of effort here. So certainly if you're looking for guidance, look to this implementation guidance document. So and even those are the two things we would say for CIP 8. The one thing that we would say from a warding perspective of it was sort of surprising to us is that the implementation guidance that has been submitted has not been endorsed. So as of now, November 5th, the ERO decided to not endorse the CIP 8 implementation guidance. Again, it is the best thing that is out there. If you're looking for some, how do we consider attempt, to kind of consume that document, understand what your peers think, instead of just being kind of in a silo of how you would define it internally. But the shocking element here is that there has been a decline to endorse this. Generally, they commented that the second guide was clearer than the first, so that's good. On the other side, it may be viewed as an ERO enterprise audit approach. So that's better than them saying they disagree with the implementation guide. It's better if they're taking the position that says, we don't want to land on a document that says you must do it this way prescriptively or you're non-compliant. If that's the reason they're not approving it, then I would say with some level of confidence that any entity that is listening on this call should go look to that implementation guidance, take the information out of it, and start being prepared for Jan 1 as how you're going to define attempts. If we had to kind of land on one standard, this is the one we were going to talk about the most. And if you look to the events that happened with SolarWinds this week and try to apply your company's definition of attempt to that right now. Let's say that happened 3 weeks from now and you were using SolarWinds. You see kind of patch updates come in, you see it talking to all of your assets, now you're aware of this potential compromise. How does that align with your definition of attempt? And would you be firing off reports to the NKEK and the EISAC if that event happened 3 weeks from now? So go to look to how you define the word attempt, look to this implementation guidance and make sure your plans are up to date and ready for Jan 1.
And then working with utilities sort of over the past year, in particular on tabletops, recognizing that every time we have sort of that decision workflow of when it is we have a reportable cybersecurity incident and sort of everything that we would have highlighted in now ye old, but in version 5, going into version 6, you're now talking way, way sooner. And to Tim's point, with a lot more detail than ever before. And so it's really interesting if folks are went through their old tabletops in the past 15 months, it may be good to just sort of dust those off and apply that definition as well and sort of see how would that have changed when you had an inject. At what point would you say, oh no, I now have an attempt, and therefore that has another sort of trigger of reporting requirements. It's an interesting exercise of itself to just be able to do that with any historic exercises you may have already done.
All right, we're going to move to the next one, which is CIP 12. We're going to spend a little bit less time on CIP 12, first of all, because it doesn't go into effect until July of 2022. So by then you will have had tons of other CIP problems to worry about. But when this becomes a little bit more urgent, we'll probably spend some more time. There is already an implementation guide out for CIP 12, and that one does have ERO endorsement. So you're in a little bit better place. This honestly has been a standard that has kind of gone out to, I'll say, formalize an approach that most utilities and entities were already taking. So main objective here is to identify real-time assessment data and real-time monitoring data that is occurring between control centers. So that's a capital C control center, meaning it's a NERC-defined term what that control center is. So we're not talking about individual control rooms at a power generation site. We're talking about kind of multi-units talking to a common area, common control center, capital C, multiple substations talking to a common area, control center, capital C. We're also talking about within an organization where you have a primary control center and a secondary, and they're talking to each other and sending kind of that real-time monitoring and real-time assessment data. And we're also talking about your control centers talking to other control centers. meaning other entities, other registered entities. If you're talking to an independent system operator, you're talking to another registered balancing authority, a independent power producer that is feeding through your system into a market. You may have a tremendous amount of ICCP links, potentially inter-control center communication protocol, where you're sending tags and data back and forth between entities. This is what we're looking at, is kind of this real-time assessment, real-time monitoring. And as the standard sat without CIP 12, there was this concern of, well, hey, CIP 5 says you need to have an ESP. And because there's not kind of ERO authority over the telecom providers or under a number of different kind of ISPs, that there was an exemption for communication between discrete ESPs. Meaning, theoretically, if you had Control Center A and Control Center B that both had defined ESPs as you're required, then the communication between them wasn't covered in any way, shape, or form under NERC CIP. There was concern of that. Most entities, regardless of NERC CIP, were doing encryption of that data either at the application level, or they were encrypting point-to-point via VPN or some type of IPsec tunnel. That was the case, but it wasn't mandated. So I think in a lot of ways, CIP 12 has kind of come forward to sort of formalize what most organizations were already doing. And for that reason, entities that are high impact or medium impact control centers, there's not a lot in CIP 12 that was absolutely shocking. This is going to be a tremendous lift. This is going to be tons of capital dollars. We're going to have to hire 10 new people. This was sort of the, yeah, we've been doing that for over 10 years, which is rare that a NERC CIP standard comes out and it gets a general shoulder shrug of, yeah, we've got it. Usually you change a comma or an and or an or in NERC CIP and it's chaos. In this case, it's probably one of the standards that has come through where most have sort of said, yeah, we get it, but could you clarify a couple of things? And the clarify a couple of things is the definition for control center, capital C control center, kind of has the associated data centers. So then a whole bunch of discussion with CIP 12 started occurring like, well, wait a minute, does that include where our control center sits? And now we've got to encrypt data going to the data center, which may be in the same room, but different, or same building, but different PSPs. What does it mean about where we pass through our microwave system that might be in a different building? What does it mean where we receive it at the other end? Kind of all those questions started to come up. And through a number of kind of NERC documents or FERC order, there's been some clarity of some of that confusion, meaning, number one, we're not talking about kind of generating station control rooms, and we're not talking about the links between gen station to gen station to gen station, or substation to substation to substation. We're talking about the links between the control centers where that data is flying across. And then all of the associated data centers that exist, whether it's within the same PSP or in the same building, that's being grouped under the entity control center, which includes those other areas. And kind of this link between the two is what CIP 12 is focused on. So that helped clear up some of the confusion in regards to, if I read the definition of control center, how many different facilities, how many different things do I need to go apply this physical protection or logical protection to comply with CIP 12? And it is this link between control centers. This could be primary and this could be backup, or this could be entity A and this could be entity C. This is the link it's covering. So specifically looking at kind of where that data is shared and the functions across them, these lines in green, again, from kind of a NERC technical document, helping between reliability control center to balancing authority to transmission operator down to generation operator, balancing authority. This is what we're talking about. Going to generation operational control room, to the individual transmission operations field assets or the generation owner field assets. That's not what we're talking about for the CIP 12 requirements. So those are the two things that I think really matter for CIP 12, is just kind of the need to do physical, which you can do up to an encryption point. It's rare that there's a control center to a control center that is close enough where you could do physical protections, but you may be looking at physical protections to an encryption device where you're doing the actual IPsec or you're doing the VPN tunnel, or within your environment, you may be doing some level of application layer encryption from site to site. So kind of where you're going to do it, and then to what types of entities. I think those are the two key points from a CIP 12 perspective. The one element that we would call out from you should pay attention to this would be in regards to what it applies to. So in just about every standard, there's been clarity from every entity needs to start with CIP 2 to determine their universe, to determine whether they have high impact, medium impact, low impact, what types of facilities, what types of cyber assets, where they're at, and understand kind of the CIP universe that they're in charge of. If all you have is lows, the drafting team has made life very, very simple for you from the perspective of you do CIP 2, then you do CIP 3. And anything that pertained to lows, FERC has done a good job of approving the stuff the drafting team has pushed through and kind of directing changes in containerizing low within CIP 3. This is an area where it seems to be, if you're doing this point-to-point control center connection and you're a high or a medium on one end and you're going down to a low, there was question of, does this apply to lows? So if you were low only, do you now have to do CIP 2, CIP 3, and CIP 12? And a number of things would lead from kind of the FERC order to the implementation. All of the different documents that are out would indicate that, yes, this applies to low as well. They don't have kind of specific applicability within CIP 12, which is also interesting. So there's nothing within the standard, the four corners of that standard, that would say this doesn't apply to low. Just going by definitions of term for control center, the standard itself, there's nothing in it that would exclude low. There's always been an approach to include the low requirements in CIP 3, but that doesn't mean it can't become something in a CIP 12 or a CIP 15 standard or a CIP 16. They don't have to follow that model. And since there's nothing in CIP 12 that excludes it, and in the FERC documents approving it, they mention the words high, medium, and low control centers. I would suggest between now and kind of the 2022 July timeframe, this is something that you become familiar with if you're a low only, that now you're living in CIP 2, CIP 3, and CIP 12. I think with that, we are ready to move into supply chain a bit. Jason, did you want to cover these slides and the EO?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. And I think with the supply chain obviously being the coolest kid on the block, or really the one that gets most talked about, since the effective date you can see here already happened in October. So if you're on this webinar and this is the first time that you've seen this, I am so sorry. This is something that we've known for a while was coming, right? And there were a lot of discussions about, well, what was going to be in this requirement. And you can see here, it's actually relatively simple. I mean, when you read any regulatory language, it looks really big, but it's really relatively simple. When we talk about having a process used in planning for the procurement of any of the best cyber systems. And so in that case, being again, a defined phrase, we're talking about both hardware and software that is gonna be used to identify risks. So we're talking about, again, the supply chain risk, the things that may be happening, and again, really relevant to just the conversation we're having from SolarWinds and the other discussion points that Tim was mentioning today. How is it that you're actually talking about identifying those risks in your supply chain? From there, you're gonna have a future-based process for what you're gonna do starting as of October when you're procuring your best cyber systems, and making sure that you've got a way to get a notification from the vendor if they have an incident, coordination of responses with the vendor, notification by that vendor when they're got to have a remote or on-site access should no longer be granted, disclosure for known vulnerabilities, verification of software integrity and authenticity, and a coordination of controls for the interactive remote access. Now, what's interesting with that is if you were to really take what Tim said before about how we're kind of in this 12-step program, if we're to divide up this requirement, which again, just sort of reading any CIP requirement from front to back, it's not that it doesn't give you all the context there. The context is there, especially when you read the rest of the things that may be in the guidelines and technical basis in the back of the requirements, in the back of the standard. But if you could logically group it, we've sort of got these two big things that need to go. The first step is acknowledging that you have a problem with procurement, and that's R1.1. So you're going to hear a lot of different things, especially there are some folks out there who are talking about all the sort of more in-depth things that you may need to do to have within this sort of supply chain cyber risk management program. And a lot of those are really good practices, sort of best practices, more mature things. But if you look at what is actually being required in R1.1, it's having a way to identify and document those supply chain risks. So with those two caveats of installing vendor equipment and software and transitioning from one vendor to another. Yes, I have a problem with my procurement, and these are the two things that I really need to start examining from that requirement perspective. In R1.2, that's where we start having contract language. So that's where you have all the different concerns with lawyers and getting in place for what do you need to do from a procurement perspective for cybersecurity requirements for those contracts. Again, as you're procuring new assets, devices that you're deploying that would impact reliability to your utility, to the power delivery, these are the things that you need to be able to address. And that again is talking about if the vendor has an incident, do you get a notification? Coordination of the response from those incidents, the notification of having that on-site access or remote access. And then if they have any vulnerabilities, how is that disclosure happening back and forth? And then verification of software integrity and authenticity. A lot of that comes from incidents that we've seen, right? If you think about things like Black Energy or other incidents that have happened in industry before, how is it that if you're going to get software, are you going to verify that that software, either patch or otherwise, has integrity and authenticity attached to it, right? Are you doing checksums? Are you able to verify that the checksum is accurate? What is it that you're doing as part of that process? There's the procurement piece that needs to be there, but then you should also be thinking about, well, this requires me to do something, right? You shouldn't be putting something in procurement language that is just going to be a nice to have. It's implying that there's going to be something that you're going to do as part of that process. That's one of the things that I would highly recommend as you look through the different requirements is not just the things that you're doing with the vendor, but understanding that it's a relationship with the vendor. And part of that relationship requires you to have a use and a sort of real world reaction to the things that you're requiring in those procurement documents. And that's also inclusive of this last point here, the coordination of controls for that interactive remote access or system to system remote access. What are you going to do sort of with those other pieces as you go through and have that relationship built out with your vendor? Now, the thing with all CIP standards, and I think that Tim really hit it on the head when we're talking about things that happen in CIP 8, when you read the requirements sort of as is on the page, it's really the what you need to achieve, right? The what are the pieces that I need to require to, not how to do it. One of the things that we talk about a lot when we teach ICS 456 is using ancillary documentation, using things that are best of class elsewhere in industry. So Tim highlighted some of the NERC documents, which is really common for us to be able to go through and say, hey, are you aware of ye old NERC CIPC document? There are a few of those out there that are still referenced by utilities when they look at things that they're trying to apply within their program, because those are built by their peers, right? They're written by utilities who are facing the exact same problems. And so if they want to understand, well, how is it that I create an ESP? There's a lot of great documentation about having a firewall instance, a three-legged firewall, four-legged firewall, what I need to have for my DMZ. And as you sort of leverage things that the industry has already created, you find yourself having a more mature program as a result, as opposed to, well, I just do this because it's what CIP says. And having that additional context is always really helpful. What we found ourselves doing a lot when talking about supply chain, because there are a lot of different conversations out there in industry right now about, well, what do you need to have in this? How do I sort of rank things and what are the different ranking orders? Instead of reinventing the wheel, one of the things that we would recommend is picking up documentation that is used and useful for you. Some of this sort of harkens back to an 80-20 rule. As you pick up documentation like NIST SP 800-161, which is a free publicly available document from NIST that allows you to start talking about your supply chain risk management program, one of the things to consider for is, well, that was built for information and communications technology. It was built for federal systems, but that 80-20 rule would apply. There may be things that are within that document that you really like that you should start building into what you've already sort of looked at because it's past October for CIP 13, right? So it's not sort of going into a silo and saying, well, this is just CIP and this is what we do for procurement because this is what CIP says we should do. There should be a larger conversation about how do you look at other standards that may be out there that are more detailed, that have additional context behind them, and that are also used by other industry groups. And so using NIST documentation for this is really fantastic. You can see there are a couple of things here that I've already outlined for you, sort of understanding the supply chain threats. So what is the sort of active space there? It's one of the things that we also do within the context of Dragos, being able to identify with our Intel department, where we have activity groups that are targeting, in particular, things that are happening in industrial control systems, right? Because the threats that are out there, the threat adversaries themselves that are targeting IT systems aren't going to be the same ones that are impacting things in industrial control systems. So being able to, again, 80-20 rule, ingest this thing for yourself, understand how it impacts your program and build it accordingly. And then also understanding the vulnerabilities to the supply chain. From there, the typical ye old risk equation, likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability. Some of those things get a little bit tricky, especially when we start talking about quantifying risk. There are a lot of other conversations we've had with that. I could even throw up some other YouTube links that I think are on this ICS channel for SANS regarding measuring risk and the difficulty there. But what you can do really well, especially within utility context, is understanding impacts from events. It's one of the things that we already have to do for disaster recovery. It's one of the things that we already do for what we have to look at for natural disasters. We are really good at disaster recovery, and as such, we're really good at being able to isolate and understand impacts that may be associated. What we don't really do a good job with is understanding that and putting it sort of under this lens or perception of what things are happening in the cybersecurity context. So as you build out things that are in CIP 13, again, just don't read the black and white that are necessarily on the page. And if you do find yourself reading those and scratching your head a little bit, there's help in other areas where we know that utilities are leveraging, and this is one of them. All that to say, we don't have a large audit history, obviously, with CIP 13 yet. It's only been out and available for a couple of months. So as people sort of learn more lessons from their regional auditors and sort of what they're finding, I do expect to have additional context for folks, and maybe that'll be an update that we want to do for CIP webinar series going forward. This is from 800-161. So you can sort of see again, they're identifying two different things from a supply chain perspective, sort of the adversarial threats, and that's definitely where I would leverage things like what we do on Dragos.com for our activity groups. Not adversarial, right? So these are things that we actually do really well with in utilities and understanding natural disasters. To then the vulnerabilities, but not vulnerabilities to the way that you normally think of them. We're thinking about vulnerabilities in terms of supply chain, not particularly the vulnerabilities that we know already exist in industrial systems, but what are the things that are within the supply chain? Where do I have sort of those sole service contracts, for example? Where are there things that I am reliant upon one vendor for? And maybe that's part of my vulnerability analysis when I think about things from a supply chain perspective. Then sort of this lens of likelihood is always really tricky and really difficult. And for non-adversarial, we actually can sort of look at occurrence-based, right? The history of things that have happened across the supply chain, and that number may be relatively low. What's interesting when you look at adversarial capabilities, that's where you'd want to get more sort of threat intelligence. There's nothing in NERC CIP, and this has come up quite a bit of times with me and Tim whenever we talk to utilities, there's nothing in there that says that you need to have sort of this threat intelligence perspective. However, there are several spots where having that additional perspective of intelligence will help you out. One of them is here within supply chain, a new standard that we're now trying to grapple with the first 2 months of it. But other parts of what we'd already do for our personnel and training programs, or how it is we identify what information of ours is out there in CIP 11, all of those other pieces can really be well informed by having another robust part of your organization that is looking at intelligence. To getting that impact piece, that last final understanding of what is risk, that's where we start looking at, well, what is the modification of sort of industrial data, right? So not sort of I'm losing my billing data. I do care about that. That's a bad day, but it's not as bad of a day as having a modification that will happen to our industrial processes. Also understanding sort of what the loss of availability looks like from our system perspective. Again, we're really good at that from utilities. And so being able to take that DNA where we're already really good at something and applying it to a new requirement or a new standard is only going to strengthen the way that you can approach this problem. It also really helps out what we found with executive management, being able to say, well, we've actually leveraged our engineers or discussions that we've had with business impact analyses or disaster recovery plans to bring it into a better understanding of supply chain risk. Now, for that 1.2 requirement, talking about the legal language, there is document, if you're not familiar with the Edison Electric Institute, it's a trade association for investor-owned utilities. However, they have public documentation here for model procurement language addressing cybersecurity supply chain risk, mapped specifically to the things that are inside the CIP standards. That said, one of the things that I would highly recommend to utilities, and this is true for any procurement language document you ever pick up, it's not simply a copy-paste job, right? When you internalize something, you're going to look at, and actually EEI does a really great job of being able to, for example, list out deadlines or like how many days for notification. And it says like to be discussed with a vendor. It does mean that there's a discussion portion here, right? Because entering a partnership when you have a discussion with a vendor where they are also helping you and responsible for things that are happening with your cyber risk program. So just to understand that as you enter into the fray of 1.2, that there's going to be this additional conversation about, well, how do I mature through this properly? With those heavy pieces out of the way, the next big piece is really just understanding that you are then implementing the program, right? So we went through and documented the really difficult pieces, and I think the two things that we wanted to cover there are already in those previous slides. Don't reinvent the wheel, take other things where you can, and tailor it and internalize it. And then from here, being able to actually implement the program.
Hey, Jason, I'm just going to mention shotgun in our last 10 minutes before we jump into the executive order and virtualization. On CIP 13, kind of keep in mind that requirement 1 that Jason covered is kind of has 2 elements. One is just understanding what supply chain risk is. So acknowledge this is standard drafting team taking its first step into supply chain standard.
Yep.
So getting every utility to acknowledge there is supply chain risk in what we purchase, what we implement, what we currently have deployed. So there's that first part where you look to other areas like NIST that have done it, but it's more programmatic and it's future looking to get contract language and get things fixed. But in parallel, they also made changes to CIP 10, where they added a 1.6 where you're verifying authenticity of current software downloads from your patch sources. You're verifying the kind of authenticating where that's coming from, so an identified patch source and the authenticity of that. In addition, kind of that active connection to supply chain. So again, kind of bouncing back to the SolarWinds. They also at the same time added elements to CIP 5 where you're looking and you need to detect active vendor sessions and the ability to disable those, but not just interactive remote access, but as well active kind of system to system connections. So just understanding those items, that CIP 13 first step in this direction, programmatic, getting contract language, getting things in place, acknowledging there's a problem, but the operational and active element, drafting team also embedded into CIP 10 and CIP 5 changes this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So that embedded DNA-ness that's happening within the standards, particularly when folks were for the first time looking at supply chain risk, and to understand again that it's not just a procurement level document. The entire intent is to have a program and that you are again internalizing some of that. And so to Tim's point, really good to be able to see that for sort of feedback loop that's happening in the other parts of the requirements and other standards, that you're leveraging the information that you've built into 1.1 and 1.2. So 7 minutes, 7 slides, shotgun for the last piece of our webinar here. The other thing that sort of we wanted to lean into a little bit was the conversation that's happening outside of the CIP standards. In particular, supply chain was sort of this dovetail that we started having a conversation around because it got picked up by an executive order coming from the White House. And in this executive order, it was talking about supply chain in particular, and what sort of things are going to happen as a result of identifying vendors that you may not need to have in your systems or want in your systems based off the supply chain risk. And so this order leaned it out, and then sort of it went to DOE to provide a request for information. Now, I put down required with a question mark because as we go into an administration change from one administration to the next, it's not that you sort of inherit the executive orders from the previous administration. So what sort of progress will happen is sort of ... TBD. However, there have been now sort of conversations that have taken place at FERC as a result of this. So FERC has taken over, not just taken over, but has actually performed actions on top of what was in the executive order, even though it wasn't mandated from the White House to be able to also examine supply chain risk. If you're not plugged into either of those efforts, I highly recommend it just to even be able to read the comments. For those of you who need some light bedtime reading over the holidays, to read the comments of sort of what's been happening from industry perspective with supply chain. There are also 2 other orders that are at FERC right now that you should also be aware of. One is a rate incentives sort of case study that's looking at, well, what are the things that industry may need for incentivizing cybersecurity investment, and sort of what are the sort of returns on equity or other financial motivations. So having your CISO and your CFO talking together in one sort of rulemaking is also applying right now at FERC, as well as open questions for what other improvements should happen with NERC CIP. Tim and I spent a lot of time on these. I think total collectively, we have well over 100 pages of comments on the record that we also wrote with a colleague of ours, Patrick Miller. where we went through each one of those to be able to give our perspectives. And we did that sort of as private citizens, as folks that have been following and being a part of industry for now several decades, making sure that when we see something like that happen, to be a part of the conversation. And that's the only thing I really want to highlight in this slide, is be a part of that conversation too, if this is the first time that you're hearing about those. Because if you're not a part of the conversation, when we have requirements come down the road later, you don't want to say, I didn't know that was happening, or why did that happen, or I don't agree with that. If you're not a part of the conversation, SIP will happen to you, whether you like it or not. Which gets us to the last piece, and I'd like to hand this over to Tim to bring us home with virtualization.
Sure thing. All right, so 4 minutes, virtualization. Anybody who's working on the virtualization team, you're going to say that is absolutely impossible to cover in 4 minutes. But the way we're going to take an approach here, so in ICS 456 in our course, we try, because the amount of effort and changes and things that happen throughout a standards development, we generally introduce kind of standards after they've been through ballot and they've been they're walking towards their effective dates. So the modifications from the virtualization effort are currently not in our courseware. We talk about how virtualization and virtualized environments are being audited today for the benefit of students, but generally we point them to get involved in the virtualization effort if it's important to you, because this is a significant kind of change. And over time, there's been kind of, starting kind of 5 years ago when this really came up from the needs perspective of, we need to address some things that were not contemplated when the version 5 standards were made. Those might include managed services or virtualized environments, or logical electronic security zones, and how to properly implement VLANs and leverage them within a SIP compliance program. Lots of things that were not contemplated, not clear guidance in the standards. So about 5 years ago, that conversation started. Of course, all of those technologies and innovations have continued to march forward over these 5 years, and the need for this has just continued to accelerate. But also at the same time, companies really started to understand and build programs around the version 5 approach, and making any change to a definition or a glossary of terms or to a standard or to a requirement can have big kind of chaos theory outcomes of how many things get touched and how many things get modified. So this has gone through that life, and the amount of work, effort, and energy that has gone forth from the volunteers in this virtualization drafting team is very significant, comparable to the paradigm shift of going to version 5 in the amount of work and effort and time and contributions that have been made. So again, kind of, there was this unofficial comment period in 17. There was all of these definitions that were being looked at, modified, retired, new. There was a number of standards that were being looked at. You may recall kind of this unofficial comment form. So if this is kind of in your mind in regards to the virtualization effort, you definitely need to sort of plug back in to kind of look going forward another couple of years into September of 2019 and looking at specifically the CIP 005. And at the time, what we were looking at was a version 7 standard mod. Tons of definitions modified as a approach, a equally amount of new definitions coming in just for CIP 005 for this single standard as being added, and then some existing definitions looking to be retired. Again, this was back in 2019. So again, if this is kind of your view of the virtualization effort, again, kind of looking to that team and what they've done, kind of this case for change document many of you may have read, like, why do we need to even discuss this and look at this major effort to shift and move, and what does it mean if we don't, based on how will audits look with new innovative technology that the standards haven't accommodated for? What are different approaches to doing this, meaning making modifications just within standards and not archiving or deleting or modifying existing definitions, but creating new requirements with the new terms, or potentially creating a whole new standard, a CIP 15 that dealt with virtualization and that was it. So if you were a company that was virtualizing, here's the standard you would go through during audit if there was certain systems where you were leveraging that technology. All of those different approaches have been looked at by these teams. Again, kind of this case for change, driving some of that. This CIP virtualization March workshop, absolutely highly recommend if this is of interest to you. to go out and kind of look through or review the recordings and read some of this kind of what's in it for me document. All of this kind of still positioning towards active efforts in CIP 005 to continue standards development. That is kind of the core where function or where activity is focused on right now in regards to the virtualization efforts. Again, kind of this September 30th, this site that you can go to, looking at the related files and kind of going through the recordings, looking at the material. This is really where you want to focus now if you're just trying to, how do we get back up to speed on where the virtualization efforts are going, what that team is working on, which standards are currently going through kind of draft and comment into the teams. For everybody who's involved in this virtualization group has put forth enormous amounts of work in regards to, this is a model that it would look like for a VLAN environment. This is what it would look like for a virtual. This is what it would look like for a traditional electronic security point with a single perimeter. This is what it would look like with a super ESP covering multiple sites. They've gone through many, many models and frameworks, lots of variations for consideration, and really the call for everybody here, if this matters to you, to get connected, give back, so contribute to that group, and then absolutely help guide the industry through workshops or through presentations in your region, or at a bare minimum, guiding through your balloters at your organization, informing them of what it means for your company, informing them of what it means for NERC CIP and the standards moving forward, and coming to the best conclusion based on the language of the draft that's out there for ballot. I think we did it, Jason. We are right on time. That is our last slide.
And with that, really, I think towards the title of the document, this is a continuous implementation project, right? We are constantly evolving. And what we're really hoping within the context of this presentation was to be able to make sure that for everyone who is, if you've not been plugged into the process, well, guess what? You now are, I mean, I wouldn't say entirely caught up, but you are got the next steps of where you may want to plug into. It's one of the things that we really like to be able to do within the SANS ICS community and within Dragos is make sure that your organization, where you can, stays plugged in, stays up to date, especially on things that are constantly evolving like NERC CIP regulations, where you're going to be impacting things that may also impact not just the security, but also the safety and reliability of your industrial systems. With that, thank you very much, Tim. I'm actually really impressed. When we started putting all the content together, just understanding how much has happened for folks who may not be plugged into the processes, to then try to give everyone at least a bit of a shotgun update that doesn't have you sort of going into 2021 scratching your head and wondering where all these new things came from. This is sort of the really major takeaways of some major standards that are getting updates, that have gotten updates, that you want to be able to stay plugged into. So Tim, thank you very, very much. And you can see here our contact information for anybody who would like to be able to reach out to us. And also, I think that last shout out to be able to, if you are able to, call for papers currently happening with the SANS ICS Summit happening in March. So please, if you've not submitted a paper, if you're on the fence of submitting a paper, please do. Not only from the perspective of maybe it's be your first time, but we would really like to be able to see first time presenters and also coach folks if you need it. So just let us know.
Thanks, Jason. Carol, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much, Tim and Jason, for your great presentation, and for Dragos, who partnered with SANS for this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.